Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to give you this talk, to offer this talk on, I guess, our second day of Sesshin. And I first again would like to express my gratitude for everyone upholding such a good container for the Dharma here at Sonoma Mountain. I appreciate it very much. I would also like to say thank you to Roshi and Shinko. It's very difficult to find a good teacher. And I want to say how thankful I am to be part of Sonoma Mountain Zen Center. Because I think a good teacher is about transmission, transmitting the true Dharma. And that is not necessarily something you find every day. And so the theme for this Ango is non-arising, which is a theme actually I picked because it's a word that Roshi has been throwing into a few talks and book discussions and things, and I felt like it was something that I certainly wanted to spend a month exploring. And so I hope you feel as excited about that opportunity as I do. And then we have the two stanzas from the Platform Sutra. The first one from Jinshu, his name in Japanese is Jinshu. Our body is the Bodhi tree and our mind a mirror bright. We must wipe it constantly and let no dust alight. And then the Response Sutra from Huineng, Chinese or Japanese name, Daikan Enno, our sixth ancestor. Bodhi originally has no tree, there is no mirror bright. Everything is emptiness, where can dust the light? So I think I would like to spend a moment talking about these two teachers. And maybe I'll talk about Jinshu first. The first time I heard this story about these stanzas, I was sitting over there where T is right now, and Roshi was offering a Dharma talk, and he told the story of Huineng, Daikan Enno, writing this stanza on the side of, I'm sure you all know this story, writing this stanza on the wall, on a wall that had been prepared actually to have an artist come and paint some stuff on it. So yeah, so the story goes that so Jinshu and Daikan Enno's, their teacher Daimen Konen, he wanted to transmit the Dharma and he wanted to select a teacher to share the Dharma with. He wanted to select a student that he would transmit the Dharma to. And so he offered this opportunity for any student to write a stanza based on their understanding of the Dharma and submit it to him, and then he would transmit the Dharma based on the merit of their stanza, how true he thought it was. And so the head student at the time, the head student at this monastery, Hongren's monastery, was Jinshu, and Jinshu really deliberated a lot about his stanza. He was like, well, should I write something? Should I not write something? I'm not sure. If I do write something, then maybe I'm like striving and trying to get the transmission. But if I don't write something, I'll never know, is my understanding good or not? So he deliberated a lot Do I submit? Do I not submit? Meanwhile, all the other students decided that if Jinshu was going to submit a stanza, they weren't going to bother because they couldn't possibly see themselves competing with Jinshu, right? So they left it up to the head guy, basically. So finally, he finally decides, well, maybe I'd feel safe enough just painting a stanza on this wall that's been prepared in the monastery to have someone come in and do a painting, have an artist come in and do a painting. I'll just put my stanza on the wall, and I won't sign it or anything, and at least then I'll know. How good is my understanding, right? So he goes and he does this at night, and Hongren sees it, and he knows right away that whoever wrote that stanza didn't really get it. But he does say something like, we should all learn this stanza. It'll bring us good merit. We should all study it and learn it. And so the students all do. They all like, oh, well, and it must be wonderful. Let's study it. Let's learn it. And meanwhile, Hongren, who his Japanese name Daimen Konin, our fifth ancestor, he says to Jinshu, did you write this stanza? And Jinshu said, well, yeah, I did, So he takes ownership, and then the teacher says, well, it's clear to me that you haven't actually, realized, so I want you to go off and write another stanza. And he deliberates and deliberates and deliberates and never actually does write another stanza. But meanwhile, everybody else memorizes the one that he's already written on the board, on the wall. And so there's a very young monk walking by where the sixth ancestor is hanging out, pounding rice in the, back corner, I guess, of the monastery. And he's reciting this stanza out loud. And Daiken Enno asks him, hey, what is that? And the young kid kind of gives him a hard time. What, don't you know? We've all been invited to write these stanzas. Didn't you hear? This is our head student stanza. And right away the six ancestors are like, well, that's not it. Can you show me where this is written? So this young kid takes him to where the stanza is written. And the sixth ancestor, he was illiterate. He couldn't read or write. So he had to ask somebody to read the stanza for him. So someone there does read it to him. And he's like, and he right away comes up with his response. And he can't write himself, so he has to get somebody else to paint it for him on the wall. There is no Bodhi. Bodhi originally has no tree. There is no mirror bright. Everything is emptiness. Where can dust alight? And so when I first heard that story, I actually laughed out loud because to me it sounded like, what if I went and got, Ajo, who at that time was about 8, right? And got him a can of spray paint and got him to come to the Zendo and spray something on the side of the Zendo. It just seemed so audacious to me, like so risky and forward and brave of him to do that. So the teacher sees his stanza and of course recognizes that he's crossed over and erases his stanza with his toe and tells the students ignore that, basically. Because he doesn't want the sixth ancestor, he doesn't want them to be jealous of him. He doesn't want him to come to harm because of his understanding, right? So that's how these two stanzas sort of came to being. And that's according to the Platform Sutra, Sutra of Huining. So that's kind of a little bit of that part of the storyline. And Jinshu, I want to say, he gets a bad rap, hey, in the sutra, in the Platform Sutra, which was probably written posthumously. I mean, if you're interested in history at all, apparently it seems unlikely that Jinshu and Daiken Enno were actually even at Hongren's monastery at the same time. They may not even have crossed paths. And it's possible the sutra was written by somebody named Katakujine in Japanese. My pronunciation probably isn't right. Who kind of wanted to bolster Huineng's reputation, right? And wanted him to look good, and lend him credibility as Hongren's, Dharma heir. But Jinshu himself, he thought of himself as Hongren's Dharma heir. Like he didn't think of himself as starting the northern school, right? Or starting the gradual school. He thought of himself as a direct Dharma heir of Hongren, and he felt justified in teaching that material. Also, just to say, Jinshu was, you know, he was an academic, for want of a better word. Like he had studied the Dharma with other teachers as well. He was a very well-respected teacher at his time. The Empress at that time apparently invited him to come to court, and he did. And when he arrived, she threw flowers all over his pathway and had him carried in on a litter that was usually reserved for royalty. And when he arrived at court, she actually prostrated before him and touched her forehead to the ground, which was unheard of for an empress to do. So Jinshu was like an extremely popular teacher at his time. You know, he was like well known, well respected, revered, even by the people in power. So, but I kind of think, I sort of feel like he's the kind of guy who would be like on Oprah Winfrey back when she had a show. You know what I mean? Like talking about his new book, right? Some sort of new book. Like all you have to do is polish your mind and you're going to be okay, right? Or like Deepak Chopra, you know, he could write a book, The 7 Steps to Polishing Your Mind, you know, and it would be a bestseller, right? Because everyone can get behind that. Everyone goes, yeah, that's what I want. I want to clarify my mind. I want to work on myself. I want to fix myself. I want to heal myself, you know. Only realizing kind of the small self side of it. You know what I mean? I feel like there's a difference between what I would call healing, you know, from personal small self suffering, and this more kind of what Hui Ning's getting at with relationship with big mind, right? So Jinshu, I feel like he was about, you know, how can I really work on myself? How can I heal myself? How can I, you know, clear these traumas? And I feel like Zazen does that. Absolutely, Zazen will help you clarify your mind. There's no question that does go on. And there's this whole mindfulness movement around that, you know, let's all sit, let's all clear our minds, you know. But it's kind of all, it's all false self-based, right? There's no realization piece in there, you know. And not to diss trauma, like I'm a trauma worker. I worked on my own trauma for decades, you know. My son Max, when he took me out for my birthday, he said to me, you know, I'm the first kid in my family who hasn't been traumatized by his parents. You know, I feel like so many children do, and maybe some of you experienced trauma in your family of origin, however that looked, right? And Zazen, it helps with that. You know, it does help with those small self hurts that we all have. And I think we have to have compassion for those small self hurts, right? The small wounds. And they're not small for people, they're really important. You know, I work in trauma. I work with people who survived the residential school situation in Canada. So a lot of sexual, emotional, physical, spiritual abuse from 5 to, well, 12 years till they left the school, right? At 17. It's like a 12-year prison sentence where people were beaten daily, people were raped, children got pregnant, you know, horrible, horrible situation. And they found 215 unmarked graves of children on the school site last May. So that's what I do for a living, is I put my hands on these people and try to help them with their small self hurts, right? So I really think that's important. I think that's important, helpful, actually, you know. Even, and if you think back to like Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, there's this famous like story of him, I'm sure you've all heard of it, of Kisa Gotami, who was a woman married to a wealthy merchant, and she had a baby, and the baby died. And she was heartbroken about this. Brought the baby to, you know, she was like, what am I going to do? She wouldn't put the baby down. It was like past 3 days, the baby was starting to smell, you know. And her neighbor said, look, why don't you just go talk to this Shakyamuni guy? Maybe he can help you out. So she took her dead baby to like Shakyamuni Buddha and said, you know, can you help me? And he said, yeah, absolutely. I'll help you. I'll help you. all you need to do is go to a house in the village and bring me back a cup of rice from a house where nobody has died. And she's like all excited. She leaves the baby happily, goes to town, knocks on every door. Hey, the Buddha told me he'll help me with my dead baby I just need to bring a cup of rice. And they're like, oh, gladly, here you go. She's like, oh, I only need to ask, has anyone died in this house? Right? Has anyone died in this house? Well, yeah, my uncle died last week. My cousin, my father, my sister, my child. She goes to every single house. No one can give her a cup of rice. So she finally goes back to Shakyamuni and says, I'm sorry, I couldn't get the cup of rice. But on the way, she has this realization that her suffering is universal, right? Her suffering is universal. And so and she actually became a follower then of Shakyamuni. She buried her baby, became a follower, and eventually did become an arhat at the time. So not for nothing. I mean, I feel like if Buddha had said to her when she first came with the dead baby in her arms, if he had said, hey, baby, don't worry about it, it's all emptiness, just is not going to fly. That is not helpful when people are suffering so deeply on a personal level, This speaks to like skillful technique, right? Skillful liberative technique. We have to kind of be able, I think, to meet people where they are, because lots of people will not realize in this lifetime. Let's face it, that's probably most of the people on the planet. So I think it's really important for us to ask ourselves, like, what's our relationship with Jinshu? How do we feel about this guy who has been sitting for years, has been studying sutra for years, and still, hasn't realized? How do we respond to that person? Because I feel like sometimes we can get a little bit prideful about our Zazen experiences, hey? We can get a little prideful, and I feel like it can be like, well, I don't think that person has realized, so I just don't want to talk to them. Or, I don't really, that person, boy, they said this and this. Boy, that there's no way they really understand, And so we can become prideful about our spiritual experiences, and this can separate us from people who are really suffering in the small self, like really genuinely suffering. So what would it take for us to have compassion for those people too? The 9% of people on the planet who will never realize, but are suffering. And so that's purely on a relative point of view. Like, that's assuming that anybody even exists, right? But still, I think it's useful to cultivate a little bit of compassion for Jinshu. And compassion, like, for ourselves when we're sitting. I mean, let's face it, we're not like realizing every moment. We're not sitting like Buddha every moment. We're not, right? Sometimes we're polishing the mirror. And Shunryo Suzuki Roshi talks about this. He says, one thing Zazen does is if you find you're projecting often and you meet, like, say, I don't know, if you meet like men of a certain ilk and they remind you of your father, then you just automatically hate them, those projections that we all have. And he makes the point that Zazen will clarify your mind and will help you do that less, project less onto people so that you can actually be with a person as they are and not the person from your past who did you so much harm, for example, right? And I think that's a valid use for practice. Beyond realization, I think addressing the small self wounding is not bad. That's a good thing, actually. I feel that's a good thing that Zazen does do. It does do that. But it's also important to know that that's not the only thing it does. Right? That's not the only thing it does. And that maybe brings us to Huining. And so we have to maybe ask ourselves, well, what was it about this stanza that so obviously cut through compared to the other stanza? You know, what is it about that that is different enough that he was the guy who received the robe and bowl and received transmission from his teacher? I think that's a useful question to be asking ourselves. And you know, Hui Ning, he first actually attained from somebody who was just reading the Diamond Sutra, the diamond that cuts through illusion. And I have a little copy of the Diamond Sutra here with me, and I just want to read a short paragraph from it for you. Assuming I can, no, I marked it off. Give me a minute. There it is. Right. So the Diamond Sutra, for those of you like not familiar, Buddha, this is a talk he gave in response to a question from Subhuti, venerable monk named Subhuti. Yeah, so he was asking, you know, most honored one, I have a question to ask you. If sons and daughters of good families want to develop the highest, most fulfilled and awakened mind, if they want to attain the highest perfect wisdom, what should they do to help quiet their drifting minds and help subdue their craving thoughts? Which is like our perfect question, right? Who doesn't love that question? But one part of the answer later on, Subhuti asks, Subhuti respectfully asked the Lord Buddha, most honored one, in the future, if a person hears this teaching, even if it is only a phrase or a sentence, is it possible for that person to have true faith and knowledge of enlightenment awaken in their mind? Without a doubt, Subhuti, even 500 years after the enlightenment of this Buddha, there will be some who are virtuous and wise, and while practicing compassion and charity, will believe in the words and phrases of this sutra and will awaken their minds purely. After they come to hear these teachings, they will be inspired with belief. This is because when some people hear these words, they will have understood intuitively that these words are the truth. So this is what happened to Hui Ning. He heard this sutra, he heard a monk in the marketplace reciting this sutra, and he asked, what is the, what are, you know, he immediately had a realization and asked the person who's reciting the sutra, where did you get this from? And he said, well, I'm a student of Hongren up there in the monastery, and our sixth ancestor, at that point, his dad had died. He was financially responsible for his mother, and he was supporting the family by collecting wood in the forest for people to burn in their fireplaces. So he's out there every day collecting. He's a lumberjack, basically. He's a lumberjack out there every day in the forest collecting wood, bringing it into the marketplace to sell for people to burn in their homes. Here's this sutra and immediately knows he just has to go and study with Hongren. So off he goes, and he actually, someone donates the money for him to leave for his mom, because there's a minimal amount of money you've got to leave with your mother so she's not destitute. Leaves her that money and then goes to study with Hongren. And then subsequently has his understanding, you know, agreed, like Hongren agrees that he gets it and transmits the robe and bowl to him. So what is different about Hongren's understanding? What is different about that? Everything is emptiness, where can dust alight? I think what this speaks to is beyond the small self-healing that happens, the small wounds that can heal on the mat, there is this one big wound. It's one big wound that every human suffers with, and that is this idea that we're separate. There's this idea that we're separate self. We think we are our body, we think we are our mind, and that is what we think we are. But that is not what we are. That is not what we are. So this wound of separation, this wound of the idea of a separate small self, is what Buddha says causes our suffering. This idea that we're an individual, that we're different from everyone else. And that's what I think our sixth ancestor is starting to address. That actually things are not as they appear. That actually things do not exist in the way that we think they do. That actually everything comes from a single source. And that source he's calling emptiness, what I'm calling non-arising, or shunyata, or Buddha mind. These are terms that all mean the same thing. They mean the big self, right? So Huineng's stanza, what it does is it returns us back to our big self identity, right? When we realize emptiness, we know that we do not exist as a body and a mind. That's not what we are. Dainin Katagiri Roshi, in his book, what is it, Universal Time, or The Universe is Every Moment, that book, he talks about this experience that we can have a realization experience and drop into emptiness, and that's wisdom. But then what happens after that is we bounce. We bounce back into this physical reality. And after that, what we have to have is faith. We have to have faith in our experience of emptiness, our experience of wisdom, because it doesn't last, right? It's a glimpse. And then after that, it's faith. We come back to the small self world. And then we're back to polishing the mirror. I swear to God, like, you're not gonna, I don't know that it finishes ever, Roshi. Maybe you could speak to that, but polishing the mirror, I don't see it ending anytime soon myself, you know? So I feel like we need to be okay with the Jinshu in ourselves, you know? I think we do have to be able to accept that we're gonna spend some time on the mat, not realizing. Like, that's just the way it goes. You know?
Yeah, it's a never-ending circle.
Yeah.
Like enlightenment, delusion. Enlightenment, gain, delusion, loss.
Yeah.
It should be the other way. Loss is enlightenment.
Yeah.
Gain is delusion.
Uh-huh.
It's never one or the other. Loss and gain. We have to lose something. And each one of us should understand what we have to lose. What's the obstacle? This the sixth ancestor, that was one of my favorite persons. There's his picture right there on the wall. And that's when was he? 600, about 600 AD?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's his body. I mean, it's pretty miraculous what kind of person he was. And there's a lot to say about him, because Suzuki Roshi called it wisdom seeks wisdom, because he had no idea of what wisdom or dharma is. Completely no idea. But because there must be some wisdom within ourselves, innately, inherently within ourselves, not his person, but his big mind, his wisdom could recognize the verse that the monk was chanting. Immediately. And this is beyond thought, beyond thinking. And I want to say it's not, what is it, 600 AD, it's 20th century also, it happens. the Pope gave a talk to Congress, and the House Speaker Boehner, he quit his job on the spot. Do you remember that? That's wisdom, seeking wisdom in the United States Congress. I'm sure I noticed that House Speaker Boehner was a kind of emotional person. He was Republican, and he was kind of an emotional person because sometimes he would cry. But also, he doesn't know anything about wisdom. He knows about politics. And so when the Pope was speaking about wisdom, the two, it's like that. It works like that. And in some cases, I think of like Lady Shakyong Diana, when she was a very young woman, she was 17, when she saw Trungpa, she left home. It's like that. I mean, this is not 600, this is 20th century. That's what happens because we don't know we have it. That's how it's discovered. Because you can't have wisdom. Wisdom is not an object. And that's what the great thing about Zazen is it's the we have this innate thing which is primordially before thinking and knowledge that is the greatest thing in the world. And this is the wisdom before we start dissecting and separating. Anyway, yeah, that's his photograph. Uh, and when we visited, maybe it was maybe in the mid '80s or something. The Shika, the guest manager, saw my rock suit, so he looked at the kanji on it, and Hoitsu Suzuki Roshi wrote it, and it had some good Dharma words. So he took us up to the Sanwon, the mountain gate, and he showed us. Uh, I mean, it was really a great honor. He showed us what he pounded the rice was. He showed us the rope, and then there was a staff there. It was solid iron. It weighed 60 kilos, and that was the sixth ancestor's staff. So I had a chance to hold it and try to carry it a little bit. Yeah, those and when you go to the sixth ancestors temple, it's a big, very large temple, and you people go there for the water. It's the purest water in China. And you remember in the six ancestors story, he had that staff and he hit it on the ground and water came up. I mean, it's still there. In fact, people go there to drink the water, and also it used to be behind the temple, and they jumped into the water. Jumped into this purest water in China. So you can't jump. You can't jump in it anymore. But anyway, it's the water, it's the tea, the six ancestor tea, only grown at the temple. And third, lastly, is to see the six ancestors' body. It's really amazing that these stories are true. So it's interesting that he was illiterate. So actually, that was his advantage. It was his great advantage. He couldn't read nor write, but he was able to realize the Dharma before reading and writing and thinking. Yeah, it's a real good story. And of course, part of the discipline is that for the people on Zoom, that we were sitting in 95 degrees, okay? You were sitting in the comfort of your house. So maybe you remained in that comfort. But anyway, this is the practice. This is the cultivation. Yeah, tomorrow I can talk about, we say the word practice, but there's 5 aspects of practice that we should become aware of. And yeah, because, practice is, the word is used so loosely. Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Good. Are we done?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.